everyone. Welcome to our candidate forum for the 1st Hampshire District of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. So glad that you could join us tonight. This forum is co-sponsored by the Daily Hampshire Gazette, WHMP, and the League of Women Voters of the Northampton area. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues and work to influence public policy through education and advocacy. Northampton Community Access Television is reporting this event live tonight. It'll also be available for streaming off their website and on YouTube. You can go to northamptontv.org at a later time if you wish to view it. So I would like us all to give a round of applause to everyone who helped to make this happen. So I would like to introduce first our two candidates. We have on the far left, Diana Szynal and Lindsay Sabadosa, both candidates for our House District seat here. Thank you. And to my right, we have our panelists. We have Bill Newman right next to me, who's a radio show host at WHMP, a columnist for the Gazette, and author of the Civil Liberties Minute. Next to him, we have Stan Moulton, who's the opinion and political editor for the Daily Hampshire Gazette. And then Jean Cherdak, who is a board member from the League of Women Voters, and she'll be asking questions on behalf of the audience this evening. So thank you all for joining us. Here's how our evening's going to work. So each candidate will be introducing herself in a 3-minute opening statement. The panelists will be taking turns asking questions, and for each question from one of our media panelists, there will be one question from the audience. And then we'll conclude the forum with some closing statements from each of our candidates. So a couple instructions for our live audience here. We have volunteers from the League of Women Voters who are collecting questions. So when you came in the room, you received a small piece of paper and a little pencil. We hope that you will write down your question, and if you just hold it up in front of you briefly, one of our volunteers will come and collect it. One thing that's really important is one of our ground rules is that every question needs to be directed at both candidates. So please make sure that you frame your question accordingly and that it isn't directed at only one candidate. Please do turn off any cell phones or other things that might make noise and distract us. And I ask that you not clap after individual candidate statements. We will join together to give them a hearty round of applause at the end. So before we began, the candidates drew numbers. So, and for who will be starting with opening statements. So Lindsay Sabadosa will be starting with her opening statement, and then Diana will be following. I think we're ready to begin. So, Lindsay, are you prepared?
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Back in February, our beloved state representative passed away, and I spent a few weeks watching as various candidates jumped in the race. I had long thought of running for office, but first had to answer the question, what do I have to offer that the other candidates do not? Why me over someone else? I have been involved in politics since I organized my first protest march at the age of 9, and I started working on political campaigns shortly thereafter. Someone mentioned the other day that means I have 3 decades of experience in organizing, advocacy, and politics, which seems appropriate because my passions are government, policy, and effecting change to dismantle the 2 root causes of all of our societal ills, economic inequality and discrimination. In fact, I have years of experience building statewide coalitions, learning to navigate the State House, and creating alliances with the progressive legislators who share similar values, but most importantly, share the same belief that we need greater transparency in government, and we need to return to the idea of people, ordinary people, being involved in the process. On the day after the national nightmare that was Trump's election, I took my despair and turned it into positive action by organizing the Pioneer Valley chapter of the Women's March on Washington, the largest single-day protest in U.S. history. I came home to continue that work, only to find people saying, "But Massachusetts is so blue and progressive, what can we possibly do here?" My answer was and continues to be a lot. You don't need to spend very long at the State House to realize it's a place where few hold a lot of power and make the bulk of the decisions. And this is especially true in the House, the more conservative body, despite it being primarily Democratic. Too often, legislation with widespread public support, Medicare for All, the Safe Communities Act, withers in committee. It's time to change that. I am that agent of change. I have relationships in the State House, both in the House and the Senate, where we can build alliances and bring the voice of the people back into government. I am the leader who will make sure that our district never, ever gets ignored. But most importantly, I am someone who understands that to be effective, you need to work in coalition. I have spent years building those relationships, and I am well known across the state as someone who fights for the legislation that would best serve the Commonwealth. We live in a time where it is not enough for a legislator to vote the right way if and when a bill comes to the floor. We need legislators who are willing to fight for and champion legislation. We need legislators who are willing to do what is hard because it is right. And we need legislators who can say that if leadership is not willing to allow change, it's time to change leadership. I'm excited to do this work, to make real change in this state, and I'm excited to do that with the people of the 1st Hampshire District. Thank you.
Please hold till the end. Thank you. Diana?
I want to thank tonight's sponsors, and I look forward to excellent questions from the always engaged and informed residents of the 1st Hampshire District. My name is Diana Szynal, and I'm running for state representative because I can offer you progressive values combined with solid experience in government at both the local and state level. I have previous elected experience as a member of the Hatfield Board of Selectmen. I've also worked in government at the county level and worked for municipal attorney, solidifying my understanding of how government works for you, the people it serves. In this election, we've talked about the really big issues on everyone's mind, creating a single-payer healthcare system based on fairness and quality care, making sure that Massachusetts is a place that is welcoming to and protective of our immigrant friends, and putting the Commonwealth at the forefront of clean energy and combating climate change. But the first step to being qualified for this job is having a complete understanding of exactly what a state representative does. There is no question that after working as the district director for Peter Kokot for 16 years, I have that knowledge. First, you must trust that your state rep will be on the right side of policy decisions, always fighting for fairness and justice and progress. These decisions must be arrived at only after looking at all sides of an issue and finding a way to come to an agreement that offers the best possible solution for the people you serve. I assisted Peter with the information gathering and helped connect him with experts, advocates, activists, and constituents to make his decisions. And I watched as he put important matters through the legislative process. He was an amazing teacher. Your next state rep will also need solid experience with budgets in order to be effective during what we know is a difficult and politically charged process. In addition to what I've learned about this from Peter, I oversaw a $12 million budget in Hatfield. I juggled those priorities. I was accountable for my decisions. Your next state rep will be relied on heavily by local officials for a wide variety of municipal needs, including public building projects, overdue infrastructure improvements, land preservation, home rule petitions, grant applications. The list is extensive and the matters are complicated. This means that you need to elect someone who has experience with these, and I do. Most importantly, your next state rep must have a solid grasp of the specific needs of the people of the district, as well as the ability to assist them in very real and tangible ways. The constituent work I have done over the years has been extensive, and I have literally helped thousands of people. It is the biggest part of my job, and it is my passion. Your next state rep must have a clear understanding of state agencies, departments, local service agencies, and nonprofits. I have those. And they must have working relationships with key peoples in those agencies. While my candidacy does not come from a happy place, I am determined and committed to put my experience and qualifications to use for the 1st Hampshire District during this unprecedented time of loss and uncertainty.
All right. Thank you both. So we're now going to begin some of the questions from our panelists. Each candidate has 90 seconds to answer each question. We have some volunteers in the front who will cue you as we dwindle in time. If you do get the stop sign, you don't have to. Oh. If you get the stop sign, please just finish your sentence in just a few words. So we're going to be, as I said earlier, audience questions will be are getting the same amount of questions as from our panelists. So, but I'm going to start with a question from the Daily Hampshire Gazette and Stan Moulton, and then we'll hear an audience question. So the first question, Diana, you'll be answering first, and then Lindsay will answer the same question.
Thank you. Both of you spoke in your opening statements about your past experience, the relationships that you've developed with government, with coalition building. How specifically, as a first-year legislator, will you work to overcome the fact that the district, not only this district, but Hampshire County will have lost so many experienced state representatives and the state senator?
Well, the first thing that I'll do, obviously, is reach out to a lot of the legislators that I already know and begin building coalitions there. There's really terrific caucuses that I would want to belong to right away. And I think the other important piece is I think that absolutely right away, all this new slate of legislators need to begin building a relationship. I like to say that I had the privilege of working during the golden age of the Western Mass delegation. You know, we had Sybeck and Kulik and Kokot and Rosenberg and Ellen Story. And I think that, what made them so great was that they worked together on behalf of all of the districts, because what's good for one is good for all. And so I think that that's something that needs to happen. There's going to be so many new people, and those relationships need to be built right away.
Thank you. Lindsay? Again, I'm going to ask the audience if we can hold the questions till the end, although those might be very little hands clapping.
I absolutely believe in coalition building, and while it is true that we will have new representation in the Pioneer Valley, we do have people who have experience in the Berkshires and in Franklin County. We have Paul Mark and Aaron Vega and Carlos Gonzalez and John Vilas, and there are people from Western Massachusetts who have been in the State House and who are willing to serve as mentors. Additionally, I'm very lucky in that I've been endorsed by many organizations across the state, and what that offers is a sort of mentorship program. You have previous representatives and senators who have received those same endorsements, and they're really excited to work with the new class coming in. So I sort of have this built-in structure where I can already call them and talk about issues and see how things are going in this budget process and in the last few days of formal session. So I'm going to obviously leverage that. But when we talk about building coalitions, I think it's very important to remember we can't just focus on coalitions in Western Mass only. We have to focus on statewide coalitions, because it is true what is good for one district is good for another, but that's not just in this part of the state. That is right across the state. We can't talk about climate change and only talk about the Pioneer Valley. We're going to have to get involved in other areas. And that's something that I've been working on and that I'm excited to continue with.
So our next question Jean will be asking on behalf of the audience. Again, Diana will answer this one first, followed by Lindsay.
Several people asked this same question a little differently, so I'm going to ask this one first. How do you distinguish yourself from your opponent?
I've really been trying to focus on my experience and really trying to talk about the government side of the job. There really hasn't been anything policy-wise that's been significantly different between Lindsay and I that we've been able to find yet. I think that, again, as I said in my opening statement, there's a lot of things that the state rep has relied upon that here in the district outside of the policy stuff. And it's really, really important when you need when you're a constituent who has a problem, you really need to make sure that your state rep knows how to navigate the system, as well as when you're a community out here and you have a need, as I mentioned, grant applications, you decide you want to build a public safety complex. A state rep will have a huge part in that. And there are big processes, there's land acquisition, there's all kinds of things that go on. And I have experience with it. And the communities really need to be able to rely on their rep for those types of things. So I've been really focusing on educating people about that part of the job and how my experience will really come in handy.
Thank you for this question. I believe that we have some shared values, but I don't believe that we agree on every policy issue. And I certainly think that our views of government are very, very different. I am not running to be your state representative because I want to go to Boston and do more as things have been done. We are not seeing legislation passed at the State House that when I go out in the community and talk to people, and I talk to a lot of people, that I see that they want. So it's time to change the way government functions in the state of Massachusetts. We have a system that is not transparent, where it's hard for people to get involved. I'm running because I truly believe in this idea of bottom-up government, where you get people in the process. We shouldn't have to be up here to explain what a state representative does, because that should be part of our civics education. A state representative should be a part of your daily lives in really big ways. And the fact that that's not the case means that our government is in ways failing right now. That's why I'm running, because I see the need for that change, and I think that's what makes us very different.
Our next question will be asked by Bill Newman, and Lindsay, you'll have the opportunity to answer it first.
The Safer Communities Act was pending in the legislature this entire session. That bill would guarantee basic due process rights for immigrants and prohibit state law enforcement from acting in concert with and essentially as deputy federal immigration agents. It didn't pass. It was, however, passed as part, a skeletal version of it was passed as part of the Senate budget. It was not part of the House budget. It went to the conference committee, and it died there. I'd like to know from both of the candidates, if you had been in the House and a representative, what you would have done this time to see that Safe Communities was a part of the law of Massachusetts, and what will you do if and when you become the representative from this district?
So there was a letter that many of the representatives, I think about 40, signed to try to get the Safe Communities Act added on as an amendment to the budget on the House side, but only 40 representatives signed, which I think is pretty disgraceful. This is a very simple piece of legislation. I certainly would have signed on to that letter. I think it's really important to remember with the Safe Communities Act that there were Republicans in the Senate who supported something that the Democrats were not able to support in the House, which really speaks to the culture of the body. We're going to have to refile this legislation. I am always going to be a supporter of it because, again, we need to do something. If we want to have a moral compass, we need to do something. There's other pieces of legislation that we're going to need to file as well. I think that we need to have a safe driving bill in Massachusetts so that people can get their license regardless of status. It makes us all safer when everybody is allowed to drive without fear of being pulled over. But the Safe Communities Act, I worked really hard to pass this piece of legislation, so I'm sorry that my answer is a little short, but I'm very frustrated about this, and it does speak to leadership having too much control in the House.
I would agree with that. I would have signed on to that letter, and you pushed hard and worked with colleagues and try to have had more support in the House. I think that it will pass next session, and I would certainly work very hard to make that happen.
Thank you. Our next question will be coming from the audience, and Lindsay, you will answer this one first again.
Where do you stand on allowing 16-year-olds and non-citizens having the right to vote in Northampton?
I'm in favor of this. I think that it is really, really important to get people in the pipeline and to get them ready to be involved in the process. We had a conversation the other night actually about this legislation, this ordinance, and It was interesting because there were adults in the room who were talking about how they didn't vote in every single election. And so it's not really just a problem with our youth, it's everybody. We only have a 30% voter turnout. I think that's shameful. That means that there are 70% of people in our community who don't engage in any way. And there are a lot of things that we can do to encourage that. I think automatic voter registration, no-fault absentee ballots, mail-in. There's a lot of ways we can get people involved, but first and foremost, we need to start teaching at a young age, this is part of your responsibility, and you need to go and vote because your vote makes a difference. I do a lot of voter registration, and I talk about the non-glamorous things that your local officials decide on, like streetlights and sidewalks and potholes, and do you want to say in that? And if you do, go vote. And in addition, don't vote. That's your right. But if you're not registered, you can't do that.
I'm actually glad this question came up because when I first heard about 16-year-olds voting, I'm going to be perfectly honest. I didn't think it was a great idea. I thought we could just leave them be. Let them have that last 2 years before they have this big responsibility. And I started asking around, and I actually didn't find one person that thought that they should, including some kids that age, which sort of surprised me. But then in having a conversation with another mom, we started talking about it, and we were coming up with the reasons we thought maybe it wasn't a good idea. But as I'm listening to myself talk, I'm realizing that those were also arguments in favor of having 16-year-olds vote. And so it was sort of through a conversation with myself where I changed my mind. And I do support that. I think that that's something that, Northampton should definitely, I mean, they have the resolution. And I'm happy about that. I think that it's going to be a great thing, and it does get them engaged earlier. Voter apathy is a huge problem. And so I'm all for it.
How about non-citizens? You didn't answer that part.
Did you answer?
No, go ahead.
That one I haven't given much thought to yet. I guess I'm open to the idea. I'd like to know more about it and talk to more people about it, see what people are feeling.
I think that if someone is living here, they should be allowed to vote. I had this experience the other day where I knocked on someone's door and the man said, well, I'm not a citizen, so I can't vote, but I'm a green card holder. And he said, my wife will be home later. Would you like to talk to her? And I said, you live here. What I stand for really matters, and you need to hear it, because even if you aren't voting, the people who are elected to represent you too, even though you don't have that right. So it really drove home the point that we have so many people residing in this country with no ability to express an opinion, and I think that's wrong.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Stan, and Diana, you will answer it first.
The state identified a $1 billion surplus for this fiscal year that just ended June 30th. Had you been in the House in this session, what would have been your top priority or two for how to spend that money?
Education, first and foremost, and then I would have gone with transportation secondly. Education, that's an obvious answer. That's an investment in our children, that's an investment in our future. That would be terrific. And then transportation, really infrastructure is part of the economic structure of this Commonwealth. We drive these roads, we know the condition that they're in, we know that we have bridges that are dreadfully unsafe. And so I think an investment in that is an investment in our citizens, and I would have wanted to divert them those two directions.
I also would say education as my primary focus for surplus funds. However, I do think that we shouldn't be putting money in places until we resolve certain issues. And what I talk about when I talk about education a lot of times is healthcare and the need to reform healthcare with a single payer system in this state. One of the rising costs for our schools is healthcare, and so I don't know that we should be throwing good money after bad. I think we should be funding schools, but we also need to resolve the healthcare crisis before we, instead of just paying for more for the rising healthcare cost. I also, though, think that PDTA would have been a great recipient for that. We're seeing people who are not able to get to doctor's appointments because of cut lines. They're not able to get to jobs, and we're being told consistently that there isn't enough money. So PDTA would have been a great choice.
Thank you. Next, Jean will be asking a question on behalf of the audience, and Diana, you'll have the opportunity to answer it first.
Okay, so I have, again, several questions on the same topic, and this is on health care. Since our system of funding health care is badly broken, a single-payer, improved Medicare for all system is the best solution for this crisis. How would you move a single-payer plan forward in Massachusetts to provide quality, affordable medical care to the Commonwealth as soon as possible?
The first thing we need is an actual substantive study that talks about how this really works, what this looks like, how it gets implemented, where the funding sources, if we can use federal funds that filter into the Commonwealth for healthcare for this. The other thing I would really like to do is I would like to see the Commonwealth work with neighboring states so that we can work together to pass something that benefits us regionally. We have a small state. People cross borders all the time for work and to live. So I think that we really need the information on how this works. Will it provide better care? Will it provide better access to care? Will it provide better outcomes? These are the things we absolutely have to know before we race too quickly into something. I don't want to see a system that doesn't work for you, and I don't want to see a system that fails. So I think we should be deliberate and cautious and have as much information as possible as we move forward on this.
Medicare for all, or single payer, is my issue. It is the issue that I am most passionate about. It is what I believe the Commonwealth needs to do. It is the linchpin that releases funds and moves us forward and gets rid of a lot of the inequality that we have in our healthcare system. There is a piece of legislation that proposes a study, an independent study. That legislation was passed in the Senate this year, and you will not be surprised to find that it didn't pass in the House. That legislation required a 3-year independent study to be conducted, and it could have been a retroactive study. The people who've been involved in the Medicare for All fight know that this fight did not start yesterday. It's been years and years and years of refiling the same piece of legislation. So we are going to have to do something, and not 20 years from now. The study is a great start, but actually sitting down with stakeholders and figuring out how we pass this sooner rather than later is going to be essential, because healthcare is 42% of our budget, and our schools are bearing a lot of that cost as well, with rising premiums for teachers, with circuit breaker funding. The healthcare impacts everything. So we need to be expeditious. We need to be smart, but we need to be expeditious.
All right. Bill, you'll be asking the next question, and Lindsay, you'll have the first opportunity to answer it.
I'd like to continue on the topic of voting rights, if I might. A 1993 law requires Massachusetts voters to register at least 20 days before an election. When that requirement was challenged, a Superior Court judge agreed the deadline was unconstitutional, but an appeal was taken by Secretary of State Bill Galvin, and in early July, the Supreme Judicial Court upheld the 20-day deadline, even though the 20-day requirement is and has been found to be unnecessary and disenfranchises would-be voters. So my questions about are, will you fight for same-day voter registration? What other legislation would you fight for to ensure the right and protect the right to vote? And which candidate do you support for Secretary of State, the office that oversees elections, the incumbent Bill Galvin, or his primary opponent, Josh Zakim?
So the Supreme Judicial Court ruling was a good example of why it matters who's governor, because those are Baker appointees. And I was really upset by this ruling. I've shared this story many times. In 2016, before the presidential election, I was renewing my license, and a man in front of me was not allowed to register to vote because he was within the 20-day window. And I just can't imagine that someone in an extremely important presidential election could not participate because of a date. I absolutely favor same-day voter registration. I'm in favor of automatic voter registration, no-fault absentee ballots, mail-in registration. I've already said lowering the voting age, and early voting. Always, always, always early voting for all elections. I don't believe we're going to have early voting for this election. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't believe we are. So I think those are some of the things that we need to do to increase voter turnout, to make people feel like they're engaged. When we have laws like 20 days, we're basically telling people their votes don't matter unless they hurry up and get there faster. So I'm supporting Josh Szynal, and I'm proud to do so.
This is all about access, access, access. People need, we at a time of extreme voter apathy, we should be doing nothing to discourage voters. So I'm in favor of all of those things that Lindsay listed, and I am supporting Josh Szynal.
So I have to say, we were joking at the beginning about who was going to be the first to spill some water. So if you,
I'm just trying not to get electrocuted over here.
one moment, you want to just,
It doesn't really, it just moves
I
it
don't want
around.
it to be a distraction.
It's
we
not.
Just,
It's
we
more
have
paper
those
towels.
wonderful middle school paper towels. We could probably use some more.
No, it doesn't, it's really, I'm
It's
just
not
gonna.
very absorbent, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. I just don't want it to distract, right?
No, it's fine.
So, okay. All right. So our next question will be posed by Jean on behalf of the audience, and Lindsay, you'll have the opportunity to answer it first.
Okay, this is about voting as well. 2018 is a critical year for midterm elections. Mass in particular has the opportunity to elect a new governor. However, the date of the primary election chosen by the Secretary of State is the day after Labor Day, and just as school is being let back into session, he's doing little to increase voter turnout. As our state representative, what resources would you support to increase voter access, and how would you work to implement them?
I hate to be redundant, but I feel like a lot of the things that I just mentioned, but I'm happy to go through them
it's
again.
probably, yeah.
Yeah, I do think in this case, it's the automatic voter registration, same day registration, mail-in ballots, no-fault absentee ballots. I'm probably missing something in the list I just gave, but I think all of those things. And, the election day is a problem. And again, that's partly why I'm supporting Josh Szynal. But we also need to get people involved. Even if the election day were September 14th or 18th or whatever, we still don't have high enough voter turnout. So it really does behoove us to spend more time contacting regular people and making them feel involved in government again, which I think is actually the root of a lot of our problems. I spend a lot of time knocking doors, and I have had a lot of people say to me, no one has ever knocked my door before. No one has ever asked me what I care about. No one has ever asked me for my story. And of course you are not going to feel invested in a process if you feel like it is somehow separate from you. So we do have to really move back to this idea of government with the people. And once we get to that, I think we're going to see greater involvement.
Right, we talked on all of that. The only thing that Lindsay didn't just touch on for this particular election is early voting, which would have been really helpful because, that last couple weeks of August is such a heavy time for people to be away and on vacation. Again, the more we can involve people in voting and in the voting process and get people to the polls and have them be interested in the elections is better for all of us.
Thank you. Dan, you'll pose the next question, and Diana, you'll have the opportunity to answer it first.
All right, I'm going to move along to another Supreme Judicial Court ruling of recent time, and that was the elimination of the Fair Share Amendment from this year's ballot. Do you agree with that ruling or not? And if you don't agree with it, how will you work to bring back the Fair Share Amendment? And also, what other new sources of revenue would you turn to immediately?
Well, I don't like the ruling. I mean, they made a decision of law. I have to respect their decision, but I don't like the ruling. I'm sorry. What would I do to?
What would you do to bring back the Fair Share Amendment?
Right.
And, but also, what other new sources of revenue would you turn to immediately?
I would hope that amendment will be brought back. I would certainly take part in that and co-sponsor or take a lead on it if I needed to. I'm sure there's more senior legislators than some incoming freshmen who would do that, but I would support it. In terms of immediate funding sources, obviously we have a surplus, so we could start using that. That would be terrific. That would offset, and we talked about in the earlier question was education and transportation, which was what that Fair Share Amendment was earmarked for. So I think we need to tap into the surplus and then get going on that amendment.
So Representative Jack Lewis has already refiled the legislation for the Fair Share Amendment. He's actually hasn't been in the House for very long, so just goes to show you don't need seniority to be a champion. But the soonest that we'll see that on the ballot is 2022 at this point. And the fact of the matter was, we know that we need to spend more on transportation and education than that was going to generate. What we do need to talk about in Massachusetts is the fact that we have the lowest tax rate in 30 years, and we need progressive taxation. And by that I mean we need to not tax the poor and the middle class, but we need to raise taxes on the wealthier citizens of this state. And I know that that is not always a popular thing to say, but it is true. In the United States, we are paying less taxes than we ever have, and we're seeing our safety nets chipped away at because of that. So if we want things like public schools and public transportation and health care, we are actually going to have to fund them. And it would be disingenuous of me to sit here and tell you that we can do those things without saying we have to pay for them, and we pay for them with progressive taxation.
Thank you. Now, Jean will be reading a question from the audience, and Diana, you'll field it first.
Our country is under cyber attack by the Russians, and Washington is doing little to protect our voting systems. What should be done en masse to secure our voting systems?
Well, obviously, I mean, I'm not not a techie on this stuff, but I think that we need to bolster, our protections, and I would assume that maybe a new Secretary of State who's willing to be a little bit more diligent on these things would be a step in the right direction. But it's diligence, and I'm assuming that there's going to have to be some costs. We're going to have to invest in making sure that we're protecting our systems.
I would really like to see us use paper ballots if we know that the Russians are hacking into our voting system. It seems like only the wise thing to do, and it feels strange that if you have a government who says, we don't need to do that, is the Russian hacking therefore benefiting the government? I have some questions about that, but I think paper ballots are the very simple solution to this problem. And obviously, yes, maybe, investments in the future, but paper works.
Like we do in Ashfield.
In Hatfield. Still doing that.
All right, Bill will be posing our next question, and Lindsay, you'll have the opportunity to answer it first.
I have another technology-related question, and it's in the field of criminal justice. And I'd like to know whether you believe that police officers should wear body cameras, and if not, why not? And if so, should there be a state law requiring body cameras or the use of body cameras, and state funding and training for the use of body cameras?
Goes to me first. Yes. Yes, there should be. I think that we live in a society that is fundamentally racist. We know that racism is part of the U.S. culture, and I know that is an uncomfortable thing to sit with, but we do need to sit with it and acknowledge it. And I believe that people who are in law enforcement for the right reasons would agree with that, and we see that because they do anti-bias training, they do anti-discrimination training. So I think it makes everyone feel better and feel safer when we know that the police are being held accountable as well. I think it's a no-brainer. But I would like to hear arguments if anyone disagrees with me.
I do support body cameras. Again, it holds everyone accountable. And I happen to be someone who's very supportive of law enforcement. I have a lot of friends, family members. It's a field I respect very much, so I also like that it provides protections for them.
Next question will come from the audience, and Lindsay, it'll be directed at you first.
Ooh. Here's a good one. Will you stand up to DeLeo?
Goes to me first? That was my whole opening comment. I spoke for 3 minutes about that. I'm going to speak more about it in my closing. But yes, we need to, like I said, if leadership is not willing to make change, we need to stand up to leadership. And I don't think the fact that that is an audience question means that I am not alone in this belief, that people are realizing that that leadership is an impediment. And it's DeLeo and it's, other powerful chairmen, but we know that a change has to come. And I really respect many members of the State House who have been saying this all along, that this is what needs to happen. So obviously, yes.
Of course I would if I needed to, but I would always try to take the collaborative way and the collaborative approach to this. I have had wonderful experiences with the Speaker. The Speaker's been very good to me. He called me the day that Peter passed away. His office has been very helpful to me. I don't feel that makes me beholden to him, but I do think that step one is collaboration. This is a group of people, the legislature, including the Speaker, that I'm hoping to work with. So I don't want to come out swinging too hard, but certainly wouldn't be afraid to do that if push came to shove, and that's what needed to happen on behalf of my district.
Stan, you'll be posing the next question, and Diana, you'll have the opportunity to answer it first.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the idea of progressive taxation, and I want to hear more specifics from each of you about what you would support in terms of more progressive taxation in Massachusetts, and how, as Lindsay said, it's not always a popular position, how you would convince your colleagues in the House that it is something that is needed.
I do worry about increasing taxes. I know that we need to raise revenue, but I do really worry about the working class. I come from a working class town. I do like the increasing the earned income tax credit. I will say that. And I really support tax incentives for people that are investing in green energy, and I think that there's things we can do there. But I honestly worry about raising taxes too much on working families. I think that I wouldn't be opposed to raising taxes, but I don't want to do it too much, and I want to do it very much with families in mind. Families are trying to afford homes, and they're trying to afford health care. We talk about that. They're trying to raise their families, and I would not want to raise taxes too much.
I am also very concerned with working families, which is why I support progressive taxation and not regressive taxation. We have a lot of regressive taxes in Massachusetts, which means everyone pays the same percentage. So sales tax, the gas tax, these are all regressive taxes. If you make $8 an hour, you are paying the same amount of tax on a gallon of gas as someone who makes $800 an hour. So our system is already unfair to the poor and the middle class. We need to have earned income tax credits, to be sure. We need to make sure that those are available to everybody, though. Sometimes people are too poor to qualify for an earned income tax credit. Those are things that we have to acknowledge when we're talking about raising revenue. And I know that there are poor and middle class people in every single one of the districts across this state. So in terms of convincing colleagues, if we talk about how popular the Fair Share Amendment is, I can't imagine how popular it would be to make sure that the poor and the middle class are not paying excessive amounts of taxes and the wealthy are.
Next question will come from the audience, and Diana, you'll have the opportunity to answer first.
I think I found one you haven't covered.
All right.
Okay. More than half the men at the Hampshire County Jail are there because they cannot post bail, often as little as $300. If elected, what would you do about this, if anything?
That doesn't make any sense. I mean, we should definitely have more reasonable bail, have maybe other options for them to be able to meet those requirements. There's no sense in people being there just for that reason. And I think that's part of a larger piece of really looking at who is in jail, who is in prison, and is there a way that we can help them other than incarceration? And there's a lot of people in there with addiction problems, mental health problems. Our jails and our prisons are becoming just filled with people who really need help in other ways. And I would certainly make sure that we're making sure that people who need help are getting help and not through incarceration.
So judges are supposed to take into account one's ability to to pay bail, but that isn't being enforced. And that's something that needs to happen across the state, because there needs to be bail reform. We are consistently incarcerating people who are there awaiting trial because they can't afford it. And that is criminalizing poverty. And I think we need to start to acknowledge that's what this issue is. I mean, certainly we are incarcerating people for substance use disorder and mental illness, but bail reform is something that we need to talk about in real ways. And we just passed a criminal justice bill that didn't take on all of these issues. And we're going to need to take them up again. Criminal justice is not something we can look at once every 20 years. We know that more and more people are ending up in our jails and prisons in Massachusetts. We're not doing very well in this field. So every year we need to be talking about this. And we need representatives who are willing to take it on, because it is not always a popular topic.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Bill, and Lindsay, you'll have the opportunity first.
Well, while we're on the subject of criminal justice, I'd like to know, when the Massachusetts legislature again takes up criminal justice reform, what your position will be with regard to mandatory minimums, some of which were eliminated in this new bill, and some of which were added in this new bill.
I'm not in favor of mandatory minimums. I think mandatory minimums are what is leading to increased incarceration in this country. We're seeing skyrocketing rates of people in jails and prisons, and we need to, first of all, we need to shorten sentences. We need to stop having a system that is punitive. We need to think of a system that is actually either that's restorative. We need to focus on restorative justice and harm reduction. And mandatory minimums certainly don't fall into that category.
I do not support mandatory minimums either. I think that for all the reasons we've been talking about, the jail system we really need to take a look at that. I will say, however, that I'm really, domestic abusers and violent criminals, I do really feel need to be incarcerated. I think that that's a matter of protecting women, and something we need to take seriously and look at separately from the issue of mandatory minimums.
All right, Jean, a question from the audience that Lindsay will answer first, please.
The Healthy Youth Act has passed the Senate for the past 7 years, but dies in committee or before the House committee or before the House. This bill would require that if a public school elects to teach sexual health, the curriculum must be medically accurate, age-appropriate, and inclusive. This is both evidence-based and common sense. What would you do about the total lack of standards regarding sexual health education in our state, and the Healthy Youth Act in particular?
Well, I'm very passionate about this piece of legislation. I have done a lot of work to try to see it passed, including going to the hearing, bringing people to the hearing. I was at the State House, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, for like the last-ditch advocacy day. And my daughter came with me, and they had us do little photo ops, and she wrote, "We need to pass the Healthy Youth Act so I feel safe in my community." And I think that really underlines what sex ed is all about. It's about increased acceptance. It's about teaching consent. It's about making people, it's giving people knowledge, quite honestly. And I fail to see how it is so difficult to pass. We do need to do, I think, some more advocacy work around it. I know that it makes people, some more conservative communities, a little bit nervous, but there's an opt-out portion of this bill. So families can, if they really don't want their children to have sex ed, they can opt them out. And I think that's key in making sure people know that. Sometimes there are so many pieces of legislation, not all the representatives really understand what's going on. So there needs to be education within the building, and there needs to be widespread support from outside of the building.
It is truly hard to believe that this doesn't pass. This is just absolutely common sense legislation. And even among conservative legislators or within conservative communities, who doesn't want to educate and protect their children? So I would just continue fighting. I will say that I applaud my opponent, Lindsay, for her work and passion on this, but I would continue to fight for that as well. It's ridiculous it's taken so long.
Next question will come from Stan, and Diana, you'll answer it first.
Okay, let's turn to education more generally. What changes do you feel are needed in the way that public school education is funded in Massachusetts, particularly in regards to the foundation formula? And also, do you feel any changes are needed in the way that charter schools are operated? Should there be a cap on charter schools, for example?
Yes, there should be a cap on charter schools. I think that there's two challenges there's a lot of challenges for education funding, but I think the two that we can tackle right away is, healthcare costs for school district employees are rolled into the budget. Those are always increasing at such a rapid rate that it's hard for the budget to absorb that. I think it's time that those costs are removed from the school budget, making it more manageable, those increases. I think that charter schools have had a huge negative impact on our public school funding. What I worry about in terms of charter school funding is that the public monies that pay for charter schools are no longer under the scrutiny that normal public monies are. So they leave, they go to the charter schools, and then they're not watched anymore. That's totally not acceptable. We need to be watching all public funds. So they need to making charter schools just as answerable for their finances as public schools are. I would also like to see charter schools unionize their teachers. That's something that bothers me, that their teachers don't have to be unionized. Those are the major things that I would change that's the funding formula reform that I would be looking at. And regional school transportation is always a problem. There's 2 regional school districts in the first Hampshire, and I've had a lot of opportunity to work with those districts over the years, and we know that's a huge burden on those districts, and I'd like to see more funding there for those schools.
The best thing that we can do to improve funding for our schools is pass Medicare for all. If we pass Medicare for all, we're not just taking health insurance costs out of the budget, we're actually making sure that they are paid for and that burden is not falling for our schools. We're providing equitable health insurance across the Commonwealth. We also then are not requiring our schools to pay for students who sometimes with disability or whatever it may be, the students require extra attention. A lot of that should be covered by health care. It should not be covered by our education budgets. I also believe with charter schools that we need to adjust the charter school formula. I do not think that charter schools should receive more money for a student coming from a district than a student whose school choices out of that district would receive. So that funding formula is flawed, and it's hurting our schools and it's hurting our cities and towns. And even if you don't have kids in public school, or even if you don't have kids, this should matter to you because it is impacting your municipal budgets.
Next question will come from the audience, and Diana, you'll answer it first.
What are your thoughts about abandoned property in the city, including Locust Street and the nursing home?
Oh, this is interesting. The Locust Street property is across from Smith Vocational is the property and I actually get a lot of calls over the years about this property, people interested in it. Smith Vocational is actually interested in it. The bottom line is that's a pretty dirty property. It was at one point a state DPW yard. I think the city used it. I think that the time has come to invest the money and clean it up. It will be costly. It's the right thing to do both environmentally and from an economic development standpoint. And then, the nursing home property, I'm kind of surprised it's sat vacant so long, but that looks like it would be ripe for affordable housing. So I would really like to think about maybe getting some interest from local organizations like Valley CDC or other things maybe in that property to develop that nursing home property.
I think that really the city does have a lack of affordable housing. We are providing some, but we do need to focus on that development. So it is going to require cleanup, but that is an investment in the city that will help then stimulate economic development. The more diversity we can create within the city, the more various types of housing that we can offer, the better off we're going to be in terms of bringing people to live here. One of the things I talk about a lot on this campaign is that I'm very concerned that we have aging populations and not a lot of younger people moving to the area. I talk about that a lot in terms of transportation, but housing is one of the reasons people can't afford to live here anymore. So anywhere that we can develop and create more housing, especially if it is on a public transportation line, because that's essential. We can't just stick people out in the middle of nowhere in an affordable place that doesn't allow them access to work or to get to school or wherever. That's going to be key, and I am going to be very dedicated to making sure that we create housing for all income levels in this town.
Thank you. Next question will come from Bill, and Lindsay, you'll have the opportunity first.
I'd like to continue the discussion of transportation and ask you both what you think you can do to make real east-west rail, and in particular north-south as well.
I go first, right? Great. So I talk a lot about the rail, and I talk a lot about the rail because it opens up our area to economic development, and that's really exciting. And luckily, we have Senator Lesser, who is the champion of the rail from Western Massachusetts, which, again, hasn't been in office that long and is still a champion. This is something that we're going to need to come together on, and I've had conversations with him saying, you do so much work around this. You're constantly there bringing up this issue. What can the rest of the Western Mass delegation do to make this happen? So that's the coalition building we're going to need to work on, because, and we can also talk about this from outside of Massachusetts, right? Because we have the North-South Rail, which is expanded, and we see amazing ridership. We see people really taking advantage of this. But if we get our East-West Rail on the tracks, which, by the way, are there, we can create a Hartford, Springfield, Boston hub. And that is exciting. That means people live and work in different parts of this state and move around in new ways. And if we're going to talk about environmental issues, public transportation is the way of the future. Transportation is one of the leading contributors to pollution. So it's an expensive endeavor, it's an ambitious endeavor, it's a necessary endeavor. So I will be fighting with Senator Lesser.
So I'm happy to report that Peter Kokott filed the first piece of legislation to look at the feasibility of East-West Rail. This is nothing new to me. I've been able to attend a lot of meetings. Congressman McGovern has been really committed to this, and I've had the opportunity to attend a lot of meetings with different regional stakeholders on this. In fact, last summer, I facilitated one at Mass DOT where we brought in all the local legislators, the mayors, we brought in officials from the Mass DOT Rail Division, and I got people in from Amtrak. So there's a lot of people talking about this and looking at this, but we need to do more than talk about it and look at it. The tracks are there, but we know that clearly this is going to require a huge investment. I think that this is when you talk about economic development, this is the heart of economic development. This allows us to move around in the state. It allows students to take classes in other parts of the state, and for people in Central Mass or Eastern Mass to come here and use our great university. So there's nothing but good things that can come of this. It's just going to require a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of expense, but we need to make sure that we're putting the commitment in so that we can get there.
Thank you. Next, Jean will have a question from the audience, and Lindsay, you'll answer it first.
Many people support a $15 minimum wage. Would you support a lower training wage for teenage employees, new employees during the first few months of employment, and/or developmentally disabled employees? It would make the increase more palatable to the business community.
I don't support creating inequality. There are teenagers who are raising families, so deciding what one should make based on their age seems very discriminatory to me. What I do support, though, is making sure that local businesses can afford that. Now, again, I will go back to Medicare for All because healthcare costs are crushing to people who are opening their own business, and I know because I own my own business and I buy my own healthcare, so I can tell you exactly how expensive that is. This legislation needed to be passed in a more thoughtful way. It shouldn't have had to go to the ballot. This is, again, an example of legislation that was filed, refiled, and finally the people said, enough, we need to take this to the ballot. But the legislator had the opportunity to really put in provisions for those tiny businesses, like our businesses down on Main Street, to make sure that they could pay this wage and still continue to thrive, or start to thrive in some instances. That's very frustrating to me. We need to be more thoughtful about our legislation, but I don't support creating discriminatory categories.
Absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. I don't like that idea at all, particularly when you got to the part about people with disabilities. No way. I would never support that. I agree, the legislation could have come along more quickly. It's happened. I think we're there. We're just about there. The legislation's passed, but we'll get to the $15. I am happy about that, but I would certainly not favor delineating any type of different structure for that.
We have time for a couple more questions. So Stan, if you can ask a question, and Diana, you can answer it first.
Economic development. Besides East-West Rail, what would be your top priority? What legislation would you sponsor and want to get through your first year to stimulate economic development, both in terms of the first district, but also regionally?
Well, legislatively, I think we're in a good place to have it happen without major legislative overhaul. We have, and economic development to me isn't all just new business coming in. You can talk about making farms sustainable as part of economic development. You can talk about the great things that are happening at Smith Voc and the students that they're turning out that are getting jobs in machine shops that are earning upwards of $50,000 as economic development. So I think that when we look at economic development, we need to look at it in the vast number of ways that we can stimulate the economy here and grow the economy and grow the tax base and create quality jobs. Green energy would be a great way to do that. We're talking about, I'm working on a project in Hatfield right now where we're supporting a business that wants to expand, that manufactures an energy efficient product, and through working with the town and working with the engineers and working with the business owners, I've written a letter of support so that they can get a $1 million MassWorks grant and make that project happen. That's going to expand the tax base and bring quality jobs. So economic development can happen in a lot of different ways without sweeping legislation to accomplish it.
So I thought of 4 things, and I will probably think of more. But first of all, Medicare for All is, again, one of the key ways that we can foster economic development. It takes healthcare costs off the backs of businesses. Affordable housing. There's a zoning reform bill that needs to be passed. It will allow cities and towns to create more affordable housing. We know that economic development occurs when we have people of different income levels living in a town. You can't just have the super rich and the very poor. We need to have people of all incomes living in towns. Also, higher ed, yes, higher ed is, in this area in particular, a great source of research and development and economic stimulus, but we need to fund it, which is something that we are not doing properly. And finally, I want to talk about the Finish Line grant, which would require 1 free year of college. And that's not that much, but if we think about the number of students who are graduating and saddled with debt in this state, that is absolutely prohibiting them from doing the things that they want to do, from starting businesses, from moving, from buying homes, from starting families. We don't talk enough about the number of people in the state who have just crushing student loan debt. And so debt-free college is another way we could really stimulate economic development.
Thank you. And Jean, a question from the audience. Again, Diana will answer this one first.
We talk about the opioid crisis and how to help the addict, but how would you help the family members, and in particular, the children of the addicts?
This is a really great question because in my constituent work, I run across this a lot. We have a really high number of children that are being raised by grandparents. I know some of these people personally. It creates a really unique set of challenges, both for the child and the grandparents. In some cases, they're DCF involved. In some cases, they're entitled to some payment through DCF for the care. But that's not always the case. some grandparents are really buckling under the costs of taking care of these children. Some of them have health problems, they have behavioral problems. So I think that we really need to shore up the funding for this through DCF, but I think we need to look at ways that we can provide financial assistance to grandparents or other family members that are caring for children in this situation. There's also some legislation pending. There's actually, if grandparents take custody, and then the parent decides to fight for the custody, the parent is entitled to some legal aid, but the grandparents aren't in trying to fight. So I think we need to make sure that we have legislation in place to make sure that the most stable and caring environment is where those children end up.
The root of this question is really, why aren't we doing a better job providing treatment for people who have substance use disorder? Children should be able to stay with their families, and a lot of times we have, parents who use, and those situations we do need to make sure that we're watching out for the safety of the children, but we need to make sure that we're really offering treatment. And we don't fund treatment in the state the way that we should. We need to make sure that people can get access. Children don't need to always be taken away from their parents, and we are quick to do that. So we need to make sure that primary caregivers can stay with their children while receiving treatment, unless the child is truly in danger. And that's a hard thing to say, but this is a disease. We're talking about people who have a disease. We're not talking about people who have done something inherently wrong or are really working to be bad parents. We need to treat disease as disease.
We have time for one last question. Bill, would you like to take the honor? And Lindsay, you can answer this one first.
Sure. While we're talking about opioids and addiction and treatment, the Supreme Judicial Court decided just a week or so ago that it was permissible for a judge to revoke a defendant's probation for having failed to remain drug-free, leading us back to the discredited notion that rehabilitation is an event as opposed to a process. And I'm wondering, as you address and when you address criminal justice reform, whether this topic of allowing people to see their way through a rehabilitative process without one strike and you're back in some kind of a facility, whether that would be part of your program.
I was really upset by that ruling. In that ruling, the person had not been, it wasn't a drug-related case. The person had gone through the criminal justice system for other issues and had substance use disorder. So you were truly setting this woman up to fail by ordering her to remain drug and alcohol free. If a judge knows that someone has substance use disorder, if you say you must remain drug and alcohol free, it's basically like saying, why don't I just escort you to jail right now? Because people relapse. This is the truth of the matter. This is a disease. This is a healthcare issue, and we can't criminalize people for it. I think that the state was really wrong in that ruling. I think that I would absolutely fight against that. People need to get treatment. And I believe that she was offered treatment in a facility and had children and didn't want to be taken away from her children or have her children taken away from her. We're lacking humanity in some of these rulings, quite honestly. We are treating people as if they are less than. And that's what we need to get away from in our legislative process.
I don't like that ruling either. And I think that, the stigma of addiction is something that we all have to get over. We are, as a society, I think we're coming along, and I think that there's positive signs ahead. I mean, there is some signs that we're making progress in this fight. I support safe injection sites. I think that we need to make sure that people have access to treatment when they want it. Medically assisted treatment is necessary. My husband had a situation this weekend. He works for Mass DOT, and he had to go clean some brush along some railroad tracks in Holyoke. And it's not a job he typically would do, but they asked him to do it, and he was there with a small crew, and they uncovered this. I wouldn't call it an encampment. It was very small. And it was, my husband was absolutely flabbergasted by what he saw. Basically, to be blunt, there were dirty mattresses, dirty needles, and used condoms. I mean, the way that we are treating addiction is forcing people under bridges, using dirty needles, putting women in harm's way as they're using, safe injection sites, more treatment, more access, and finally doing away with the stigma of addiction and facing this head on is the only way we're going to solve this.
Thank you. That concludes this portion of our evening. It's close to 100 degrees in here, and I'd like to thank everyone for hanging in with us. I'd like to give each candidate an opportunity to make some closing statements. So since Lindsay opened the evening, Diana, you will go first in closing.
I thank you all for the wonderful questions. I thank the Gazette, the League of Women Voters, WHMP, and NCTV for bringing us all together. And I thank Lindsay for yet another evening of quality time together. We've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time together lately. In closing, many people don't realize that I'm the only person Peter ever hired. It was just the two of us for 8 years. Eventually, as he became House Chair of Ethics, I would have the pleasure of working with committee staff on legislative matters. Those staff members traveled with us to state administration and healthcare finance. They are wonderful colleagues, and I continue to work with them to this day, but they belong to the committee. I still belong to Peter. Peter never asked for staff in addition to me. This means I did a lot of work, and I was involved in every aspect of his service. We recognize that the political landscape in Western Mass is changing. We've lost our champion, Peter. The recent resignation of Senator Rosenberg was also a devastating blow. We're about to lose Rep. Sybeck and Kulik to retirement, but we must move forward. I've had the privilege of working for all of you for 16 years. I've learned this job from the bottom up. I have the support of local legislators. I have the support of other legislators from around the state. I have the support of chosen leaders like Mayor Narkowitz and District Attorney Sullivan. I have the support of several Northampton City Councilors, as well as selectmen from each district town. This is great for me, but it's really great for the 1st Hampshire. It means that I already have the important collaborations that are critical when trying to get things done in Boston. In me, you will get a state representative who is experienced, qualified, trusted, and has shown demonstrated dedication to this district. You deserve a state representative who is ready to serve on day one and who will be the steady hand to guide us in the future. I ask for your support as I seek this very important seat during this very important time.
Lindsay?
Thank you to the League of Women Voters, the Gazette, WHMP, NCTV, Diana, and the audience for this wonderful evening. And as always, a special thanks to my daughter, who, despite sometimes feigning boredom, remains a true supporter. The people of the 1st Hampshire District have a crucial decision to make on Tuesday, September 4th. Our country and our district are at a crossroad. Intolerance is everywhere in our current political climate, but in the state of Massachusetts, we have an opportunity to be a leader for the rest of the country. But only if we elect representatives who understand that to make change, you need a vision of what the future can look like. Being progressive is more than just having a progressive agenda. It means bringing the power of the people into government and working for and with all constituents. A progressive understands that top-down government only works for a few, but bottom-up government works for everyone. Not all Democrats are the same. In this race, I'm the fighter. I will fight for Medicare for all. I will fight for free universal pre-K and higher ed. I will fight for education funding reform, and I will fight for public transportation, including East-West Rail. And I will not be alone in this fight because I have spent years building relationships with legislators, advocates, and activists from across the Commonwealth. Because of my experience, I know how the State House works, and it's time for political courage and true progressive leadership. This is a time for visionary leaders who will work to uphold and protect our democracy. Individually, we accomplish very little. Together, we can persist, resist, organize, strategize, and create a future that's different. We can create a future where the people take back their government. My greatest hope is that you leave here tonight feeling like I do, inspired, energized, and ready to dig in to do the hard work together. With that, I ask for your support on September 4th.
Please join me in thanking both of our candidates. All right. Thank you to our panelists, to our sponsors, League of Women Voters, NCTV, and to our audience members. We're voting the day after Labor Day. Let's try not to forget and make sure we get to the polls. So thank you for coming.